In New York, this is Democracy Now!
This is the decisive decade. This is the decade we must make decisions that will avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis.
President Biden hosts a virtual global climate summit and pledges to cut U.S. emissions in half by 2030. But environmental groups say global leaders are not being ambitious enough to address the climate emergency. We'll speak to former Amnesty International head Kumi Naidoo in South Africa.
Only when leaders ensure that climate action explicitly addresses inequality, poverty, deprivation, alienation, and injustice will the transition to green, inclusive economies fully take off.
We'll also look at the link between the climate crisis and migration in Central America and speak to a leading climate activist in Mozambique. Plus, we talk to Kate Aronoff, author of the new book, Overheated: How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The White House convened a virtual summit on the climate crisis Thursday, with 40 leaders representing the world's major economies pledging cuts to greenhouse gas emissions. President Biden said the U.S. would slash greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% below 2005 levels by the end of the decade, nearly double the target set by the Obama administration 6 years ago.
This is a moral imperative, an economic imperative, a moment of peril, but also a moment of extraordinary possibilities.
Chinese President Xi Jinping called on wealthy nations to do more to help poorer countries face the climate crisis. He repeated a pledge to cut emissions in China, which recently passed the U.S. as the world's biggest carbon polluter.
China will strive to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060.
The climate summit continues today with a focus in part on the role of big business. Speakers include billionaires Mike Bloomberg and Bill Gates. On Capitol Hill, the House Subcommittee on the Environment heard testimony Thursday on the role of fossil fuel subsidies in preventing action on the climate crisis. Swedish activist Greta Thunberg spoke of a widening gap between what countries are doing and what actually needs to be done in order to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, Native American lawyer and environmental activist Tara Houska said indigenous people should be front and center in any debate over the climate.
The reality is that we're just 5% of the population globally, indigenous people, and we hold 80% of its biodiversity. We're the last holders of the sacred places all over Mother Earth. Despite this, our voices are almost entirely absent from the table of solving climate crisis. We have to protect communities that are at risk, like my own. We are the people who are impacted first and worst by climate crisis, yet we are the people who often contribute the least to climate crisis.
New York City has filed a lawsuit charging some of the world's biggest oil companies with systematically and intentionally deceiving New Yorkers about the dangers posed by their products. Mayor Bill de Blasio said Thursday the industry has for decades spread false advertising that violates New York's consumer protection laws.
There's been a consistent effort by the fossil fuel industry to tell us they're making things safe and green when it just isn't true. So the city of New York will be filing a lawsuit against big oil in state Supreme Court. We're specifically targeting Exxon, Shell, BP, and the American Petroleum Institute, which is the trade group for big oil.
After headlines, we'll spend the rest of the hour on the climate emergency. India has reported the world's highest ever one-day tally of coronavirus infections for the second straight day, with nearly 1/3 new cases reported. COVID-19 deaths also jumped to a new record daily high for India at nearly 2,300. Hospitals across India's northern and western states are rapidly running out of beds and running low on oxygen. Mass cremation sites have been operating around the clock. Meanwhile, at least 13 COVID patients were killed early Friday after a fire broke out at the intensive care unit of a hospital near Mumbai. It was the second hospital disaster in India this week. South Africa's resumed use of Johnson & Johnson's single-dose, one-and-done COVID-19 vaccine, ending a temporary pause that followed reports of extremely rare but severe blood clotting in patients. Fewer than 1 in a million recipients of J&J's shot developed the disorder. Here in the United States, a panel of vaccine experts meets today to discuss whether to recommend resuming use of the shots. Daily coronavirus infections continue to hold steady at a relatively high level in the U.S., with 67,000 new infections and more than 900 deaths reported Thursday. Meanwhile, a new study in the Journal of the American Medical Association confirms pregnant people have an elevated risk of complications and death from COVID-19. The disease raised the risk of preeclampsia, preterm birth, and ICU admissions, with pregnant patients 22 times more likely to die than those who did not become infected. The House voted Thursday to make Washington, D.C. the 51st U.S. state. The new state would be called Washington Douglas Commonwealth, after abolitionist Frederick Douglass, and would exclude federal buildings and monuments. The measure would give over 700,000 D.C. residents 1 representative in the House and 2 senators. The Biden administration's backed the bid for statehood, but it faces a stiff battle in the evenly divided Senate, where it would need 60 votes to pass. The Senate passed a bill targeting anti-Asian hate crimes, which have seen an exponential rise since the start of the pandemic. The measure would create a Justice Department position focused on the issue, which would review hate crime reports. A single no vote was cast by Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, the Trump ally who helped incite the deadly January 6th insurrection. Hawley called the bill too broad. The bill will be voted on by the House before heading to Biden's desk. The House passed the No Ban Act Wednesday, limiting a president's ability to impose discriminatory entry bans like the Muslim travel ban ordered by President Trump in 2017. This is Indiana Congressmember Andre Carson.
We knew that this was never about keeping America safe. It was all about enshrining Islamophobia and xenophobia as the law of the land. Though President Biden lifted these bans, our bills will ensure history does not repeat itself in this way again.
Indiana Congressmember Andre Carson was one of the first 2 Muslim congressmen. The House also passed legislation ensuring U.S. citizens and residents who are detained at ports of entry have access to legal counsel. A new report finds the government of Haiti may be complicit in crimes against humanity. Harvard University Law School researchers found Haitian President Jovenel Moïse has sanctioned attacks against civilians in impoverished neighborhoods of Port-au-Prince, with targeted assassinations and threats against government critics carried out with impunity. This comes as the Biden administration has deported more Haitians in a few weeks than President Trump did in all of 2020. A group of Democratic Congress members introduced the Honduran Human Rights and Anti-Corruption Act this week. The bill imposes sanctions on Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernández and suspends U.S. security assistance and weapons for the Honduran police and military. This comes as Hondurans continue to flee the dire social and economic conditions at home, but many are not granted the opportunity to apply for asylum if they reach the U.S. On Wednesday, 85 Honduran migrants were deported from the U.S.
Yesterday, I was deported at 5 p.m. without reason. I was not told I was being deported. Nothing. I was suddenly asked to get ready in 5 minutes. I was told I would be picked up, and I was taken to the airport at 3 a.m., and then I was deported.
In Colombia, indigenous governor Sandra Liliana Peña was gunned down in the Cauca region. Days before her murder, she publicly condemned the increasing amount of illicit crops being cultivated locally. Rights groups say she was at least the 52nd social leader killed this year, and that over 1,100 activists and land defenders have been killed since the 2016 Colombia peace deal was signed. A warning to our audience, the next story contains graphic descriptions of violence against women. In Kuwait, women rallied Thursday to demand safety and justice after the brutal murder of a woman earlier this week. The woman had filed against her murderer for harassment after she refused to marry him, but he was released on bail, went on to kidnap and stab her to death. This is a protester in Kuwait City.
It is very scary and very sad that in my own country, when I get into my car, I feel I need to lock the doors immediately. And it is very scary and very depressing that I have already taught my daughters how to protect themselves by holding their keys in a certain way while they're walking to their car, or asking someone to accompany them from their place of work or study to their vehicles. It's very scary that this is what our country has come to.
In New York, a woman who had to go through labor while her wrists and ankles were shackled by police has settled for $750,000 with the city and the New York Police Department. The woman, who's African-American, went into labor the day she was arrested and gave birth while handcuffed to a hospital bed without her family or her doctor present. She sued for emotional distress and a violation of her civil rights. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected imposing limits on sentences for life without parole for juveniles. The 6-3 ruling reverses a trend towards more leniency for children and teens convicted of a crime and highlights the Supreme Court's strong conservative advantage. Justice Sonia Sotomayor was joined by the two other liberal judges in her dissent. She wrote, "The state must consider whether a juvenile offender has demonstrated maturity and rehabilitation sufficient to merit a chance at life beyond the prison in which he has grown up. For most, the answer is yes," she said. In North Carolina, protesters took to the streets of Elizabeth City for a second straight night to demand justice for Andrew Brown Jr., a black man shot dead by police officers serving an arrest warrant Wednesday morning. Eyewitnesses described an unlawful, unjustified killing, unquote, by multiple officers who opened fire as Brown tried to flee in a vehicle. This is Brown's neighbor and longtime friend.
And I've got my neighbor across the street killed, and my baby comes running in my room with fear in his face. Like, how do I keep him safe if the people that are supposed to serve and protect us and keep us safe are the ones taking him out?
A family lawyer said Brown was unarmed and demanded the release of police body camera footage. And in Minnesota, mourners gathered Thursday for the funeral of Daunte Wright, a 20-year-old black father who was shot dead by a white police officer during a traffic stop in the Minneapolis suburb of Brooklyn Center. Daunte's mother, Katie Wright, fought back tears as she remembered her son.
I never imagined that I'd be standing here. The roles should completely be reversed. My son should be burying me. Oh, my son had a smile that was worth $1 million. When he walked in the room, he lit up the room. He was a brother, a jokester. He was loved by so many. He's going to be so missed.
A number of prominent Minnesota politicians attended Daunte Wright's funeral, including Minneapolis Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, State Attorney General Keith Ellison, Governor Tim Walz, and U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar. This is Wright family attorney Ben Crump.
Before I give the plea for justice, let me have you join me in proclaiming that Daunte Wright life mattered, so his mother, Katie and Aubrey Wright, will know that we believe it when we quote it. Up on your feet, if you would. Daunte Wright life mattered. Daunte Wright life mattered. Daunte Wright life mattered.
Daunte Wright's funeral came just 2 days after a jury found former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin guilty of murdering George Floyd in a killing that set off the largest protests in U.S. history. This is Reverend Al Sharpton, who delivered the eulogy at Daunte's funeral.
The time has come for America to stand up and bring a new day to where we don't have to explain to our children what to do when the police stop you. It's time to bring a new day where we don't have to videotape when we see a badge, but where we know that they're there to serve and protect, not treat us like we've been convicted. The time has come for police to understand they're not above the law. They're to enforce the law.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the Quarantine Report. When we come back, we spend the hour on the global climate emergency. Stay with us. Trumpeter Keyon Harold and artist Ange Hills painting a portrait of Daunte Wright yesterday at his funeral service. In December, Keyon's 14-year-old black son was attacked by a woman at a New York hotel when he was with his father. The woman falsely accused him of stealing her iPhone and got security to go after the father and son as well. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Sign up for our daily news digest email by texting Democracy Now!, one word, no space, to 66866 today. Well, the White House is continuing to host a virtual summit on the climate crisis today, with 40 leaders representing the world's major economies, including China. On Thursday, President Biden pledged to cut U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in half, below 2005 levels by the end of the decade. That's nearly double the target set by the Obama administration 6 years ago.
The United States sets out on the road to cut greenhouse gases in half by the end of this decade. That's where we're headed as a nation. And that's what we can do if we take action to build an economy that's not only more prosperous, but healthier, fairer, and cleaner for the entire planet. You know, these steps will set America on a path of net zero emissions economy by no later than 2050. We know just how critically important that is, because scientists tell us that this is the decisive decade. This is the decade we must make decisions that will avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis. We must try to keep the Earth's temperature to an increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
The European Union has pledged to cut carbon emissions by 55% compared to 1990 levels. Chinese President Xi Jinping repeated his pledge for China to cap emissions by 2030 and be carbon neutral by 2060. He also vowed to reduce China's dependence on coal. Despite the new commitments, environmental groups warn more action needs to be quickly taken. Greenpeace has called on Biden to reduce U.S. emissions by 70% by 2030 and to phase out fossil fuels. The climate summit continues today with a focus in part on the role of big business. Speakers include billionaires Mike Bloomberg and Bill Gates. We begin today's show with Kate Aronoff. She's a staff writer at The New Republic. Her new book is just out. It's titled Overheated: How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back. Can you respond to yesterday's and today's Earth Day summit of at least 40 world leaders called by President Biden, what he has set as goals for the U.S. and what others are setting for their own countries?
Yeah, I've been to a lot of these types of summits before. They're not so strange in the realm of global climate policy making, leaders coming together, making pronouncements, and, generally feeling good about one another. So, it's good that this happened, right? So what Biden announced yesterday, this reduction of 50% below 2005 levels by 2030, this is fulfilling a basic requirement of the U.S. being in the Paris Agreement, which is to have an updated 2030 target, which we didn't have before this, and needed to update the previous 2025 target, which Joe Biden had. That's a lot of sort of UN minutia talk. But all this is to say, what happened yesterday was the U.S. fulfilling, again, this basic requirement of being in the Paris Agreement. So it's good that we've done that, right? But as you mentioned at the top of the show, right, this is well below what the United States really owes to the rest of the world based on its historical responsibility for causing the climate crisis and the massive resources this country has to transition very quickly off of fossil fuels. And, there is still no plan, really, even to fulfill that really basic requirement and even to fulfill this sort of low bar target that Biden laid out yesterday. It's good that obviously sort of China is coming to the table. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that would happen. This is, a good step toward more concrete action. But ultimately, these summits tend to play out in pretty similar ways, right? There isn't, a plan back home in the U.S. to make good on this. We haven't passed any climate legislation yet. We might still, but what's on the table, does not get to that low bar goal. Certainly doesn't get to the 70% reductions needed. And we've seen really weak commitments on climate finance. There, should be $800 billion with a good faith down payment, as Friends of the Earth has pointed out, and many other groups sort of looking at the concept of a fair shares of the United States historical responsibility. So it's just way too little, way too late.
So in your new book, Kate, called Overheated: How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back, you argue that the pro-business politicians on both sides of the aisle, as well as organizations like the UN and World Economic Forum, mistakenly believe that capitalism and the market hold the best solutions for climate change. I mean, today, for example, Bill Gates, two billionaires, Bill Gates and Mike Bloomberg, will address the global summit.
Yeah, and we see this even amid what, to be really fair, have been pretty ambitious commitments from the Biden administration on climate, far more ambitious, I think, than anyone would have expected, amid a Democratic primary in which he had the least ambitious climate plan based on Joe Biden's career as a real, centrist who has never been out front on these issues. He surprised a lot of people, including me. But still, we see built into these plans, which, again, are much too small, including the American Jobs Plan he put out a couple weeks ago, a real focus on, really spurring on the private sector to do this work, right? So the theory, right, is that if you just put a little bit of money into the private sector, sort of spur on research and development through things like tax credits, that will, catalyze the sort of action necessary, and doesn't really see government as the protagonist of decarbonization, which it absolutely can be, right? And having, people like Bill Gates, people like Michael Bloomberg be posited as the sort of heroes, be putting corporations on a pedestal as the sort of protagonist of decarbonization is both, wrong on its face, right? We've never seen the private sector really take the sort of action needed, despite years and years and years of this rhetoric from not just the U.S., but in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change spaces. That is very much the sort of language of the day, is to catalyze private sector action. And we just haven't seen it happen, right? And there is just a real reticence in particular to go after the fossil fuel industry, which we know is fueling this problem, and which, has been for years and years and years delaying action and even, funding people who deny the crisis exists at all.
So at the same time that the global summit, climate summit, was happening, there was a House hearing led by Ro Khanna on fossil fuel subsidies. California Congressperson Katie Porter grilled Frank Macchiarola of the American Petroleum Institute, which represents about 600 U.S. oil and natural gas companies. This was the exchange.
Why do I have to pay for you to shill for oil companies? Why do we as taxpayers have to pay subsidies to the oil and gas industry?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. So the federal leasing of oil and gas development produces a significant amount of funding for the Treasury. In fact,
reclaiming my time, Mr. Macchiarola.
I'd like to,
Mr. Macchiarola, excuse me, but the evidence is clear. We taxpayers subsidize the oil and gas industry. We did it this year alone in the middle of the world's greatest pandemic, $15.2 billion in direct pandemic relief alone to fossil fuel companies. And the fossil fuel industry turned around in 2020 and spent $139 million on political donations and $111 million lobbying. Look, I get it. You drill in the Arctic refuge, you take out oil and gas, and you poison the planet. Bad enough. But why should taxpayers have to subsidize that activity? It's a bridge too far.
So that's Congressmember Katie Porter. Kate Aronoff, explain these subsidies and the significance of this interaction.
Yeah, and I mean, Katie Porter lays out the case pretty well, I think. So there's a range of subsidies that, the fossil fuel industry takes in and is really dependent in a lot of ways on state support and has been for a very long time, whether that's things like the intangible drilling tax credit, where they can write off the expense of exploring for new oil or drilling for new oil reserves, or preferential land leasing that they get to take up land leases on public land for oil and gas drilling. Or even things like railroads, right? That have transported coal for a long time. Export permits to send fossil fuels abroad. There is not a fossil fuel industry in the United States without state support for the fossil fuel industry in the United States. Its profits are entirely dependent on a huge amount of state support. And, I think the industry likes to make the case that, well, this creates jobs. This is, a key part of our economy. And as Katie Porter pointed out, the fossil fuel industry got a lot of support for the pandemic, in particular, through sort of emergency relief funding. And 77 oil and gas companies got $8.2 billion in support and laid off 16% of their workforce. The idea that these companies are job creators and are interested, in creating sort of a middle-class life for big parts of this country is just wrong, right? They are interested in union busting, as they have been historically. They're interested in firing as many people as possible to bring down production costs. And they can't exist. So I think, when the fossil fuel industry comes out and says, as they do reliably, that climate action, is a big imposition of government into the lives of the U.S., that, we shouldn't pick winners and losers in the energy sector. The U.S. government has been picking winners for a very, very, very long time, and it's time to pick new winners. It's not a matter of, that subsidies are bad. It's that we're subsidizing the wrong things.
I wanted to turn to 18-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, who also testified at that Ro Khanna House hearing as the global summit was taking place at the White House.
I know I'm not the one who's supposed to ask questions here, but there is something I really do wonder. How long do you honestly believe that people in power like you will get away with it? How long do you think you can continue to ignore the climate crisis, the global aspect of equity and historic emissions without being held accountable? You get away with it now, but sooner or later, people are going to realize what you have been doing all this time. That's inevitable. You still have time to do the right thing and to save your legacies. But that window of time is not going to last for long. What happens then? We, the young people, are the ones who are going to write about you in the history books. We are the ones who get to decide how you will be remembered. So my advice for you is to choose wisely. Thank you.
That's now 18-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg testifying before the House Oversight Subcommittee on the Environment around the issue of the role of fossil fuel subsidies in preventing action on the climate crisis. Kate Aronoff, your final thoughts on your call for a nonviolent economy and other ways to transition to economy that you argue should not be centered around fossil fuels and other capitalist solutions to the climate emergency.
Yeah, like I said before, the call for a nonviolent economy is really about redirecting the amount of state support we pour into violence, right, in the form of fossil fuel subsidies, but also our enormously bloated military budget, a foreign presence in all corners of the earth, and really thinking about what is the foundation of a good life. How do we make a good life for most people, not just in the U.S., but thinking, of ourselves as really intertwined with the fate of everyone on the planet, as we've seen through the pandemic, right? Our fates are all really deeply bound up in each other. And if there are emissions coming from one part of the world, that hurts all of us. And so, I think we need to redirect that enormous amount of state support that is currently fueling the things that are killing us into the type of world we need, right? Not just to scale up clean energy, but, to do the sorts of valuable work that the private sector, consistently does not think are valuable, from, caring for the elderly to healthcare jobs, which we, have found out are a real crisis and are a big source of low carbon, often unionized work. So, I think it's really about reorienting our priorities and thinking about what goals we're chasing, which to my mind should be, to bring down carbon emissions as quickly as possible, create a managed, orderly decline of the fossil fuel industry, which puts workers first and allows them, a democratic say over what this transition looks like, and really to, make people's lives better in the short term, so that we can, really have the sorts of society we need that's, cleaner, but also more democratic, more abundant, and more leisurely.
Kate Aronoff, I want to thank you for being with us, staff writer at The New Republic. Her new book, Overheated: How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back. We'll also link to your piece in the New York Times out on Earth Day. Biden is all about zero emissions, but who do you think has been fueling them? As we continue to discuss President Biden's climate summit, we continue. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the quarantine report. And we look now at the link between the climate emergency and migration. Studies have estimated climate change could displace over 200 million people by 2050, including many in Central America, including Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Last year, 2 hurricanes devastated the region, forcing thousands to flee. We go now to Camila Bustos, Human Rights Associate at the University Network for Human Rights, one of the co-authors of a new report titled Shelter from the Storm: Policy Options to Address Climate-Induced Displacement from the Northern Triangle. It was recently published in collaboration with experts from Harvard Law School and Yale Law School. Camila Bustos, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Why don't you lay out your findings?
Hi, Amy. Thanks for having us. So as you explained, our findings indicate that climate change is already acting as a driver of migration in the Northern Triangle. We know people leave for multiple reasons. We know those have to do with the social conditions, economics, politics, violence. But we know that climate is accelerating in many cases, and amplifying those factors. So we have to prepare for that. And we have to plan around migration. We know we can't expect it to just happen and, have those lives upended and at risk. So what we're asking the Biden administration is to really plan ahead for the major migration flows. And, earlier this year, the Biden administration issued an executive order, the first of its kind, really, on climate migration, which we applaud. And I think it's a great first step of many more to come. Because as I said, and as you've, in your show, you've discussed, climate change disproportionately affects folks in the global south, particularly in places like, Central America. The Northern Triangle region is vulnerable because of its geography, because of its economy, because of the current violence and political instability. So what we're really telling the administration is to take this data, look into it, think critically and creatively about solutions, and revise immigration policy.
Among other demands in the report is a climate visa. Explain, Camilla.
So there are already existing mechanisms that have allowed people to come to the United States to do so with dignity after, a hurricane. For instance, it happened with Hurricane Mitch. So there are programs in place that allow people to come, but those are limited for many reasons. Limited because they may only target things like hurricane, which are instant climate impacts, but disregard, long-term impacts like droughts or coastal erosion. So in that sense, the existing programs are not enough. They also tend to protect folks who are already here, who enter perhaps without status, and who now can return to their country because of a particular disaster. But we really think the climate crisis in many ways is unprecedented. And our immigration system, which advocates have said for years is broken, is not enough as it is. It needs reform. It needs reform from many different angles, but especially from climate change. It needs to integrate climate change. So by a new climate visa, we are really asking, Congress and the Biden administration to take the climate crisis seriously and to think creatively about how to facilitate a way for folks to come either permanently or temporarily, but that allows them to do so with dignity, with a work permit, eventually perhaps to apply for residency. So I think a lot of the details are still to be determined, but that's why we are, again, putting the idea out there. It's already, it's new, but last Congress, a piece of legislation was introduced by Representative Velasquez and Senator Markey on this idea of climate displacement and the creation of a new category of people. So again, they're new ideas, but they're not unprecedented, and the crisis in the moment that we're in calls for it.
On Thursday, during the virtual Global Climate Summit, the Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, proposed the United States offer work visas and citizenship to participants in Mexico's vast tree planting program. This is what he said.
El gobierno de Estados Unidos podría ofrecer.
The United States government could offer those who participate in this program that after sowing their land for 3 consecutive years, they would have the possibility to obtain a temporary work visa, and after another 3 or 4 years, they could even obtain residency in the United States or their dual nationality. The migratory phenomenon, as we all know, is not resolved with coercive measures, but with justice and well-being.
That's the Mexican president. Camilla, respond to his proposal.
Again, the fact that this is already on the agenda is a good one. I think all proposals deserve careful consideration, but I think current proposals are not enough, both in terms of emissions, as we discussed earlier in the show, but also in terms of the current immigration framework. Work visas are good, but they're not the end-all solution. This crisis requires steps on all fronts. And again, it's not just Mexico, right? We're talking about like Central America and the world, really, the global South. In our report, we argue that we do owe a special debt, ecological and moral debt, to the region because of the particular role that the United States has played, not only, again, in contributing massively to climate change, but also in destabilizing many of the economies in Central America through foreign intervention, through foreign policy, right? So, again, I think the fact that this is being discussed is a good step, but it's not enough. And we need to think creatively, not just on work visas, but all other forms, other vehicles for relief that would allow people to respect people's rights and allow them to migrate with dignity.
Can you talk about how U.S. policy in Central America drives people north, and particularly the issue of Central America being so dangerous for land defenders, for environmentalists? For example, Berta Cáceres, who was gunned down in her home, well known in Honduras and around the world for her environmental activism. Can you talk about how U.S. policy and extractive projects such as mines and dams have made the region more deadly for those who are fighting to save the planet?
Absolutely. I mean, it's tragic. It's tragic what's happening around the world, but especially in Central America and Latin America. We know it's one of the most dangerous regions to be an environmental activist. That is a serious issue that we have to confront, particularly because these folks are fighting for their land, for their water, And because of that, we want to call attention to the impact of climate on migration and the fact that climate change is happening. And while mitigation of emissions is certainly needed, there's already a level of warming that we're locked in, right? So even if we were to stop emissions today or tomorrow, that there's already impacts that are being felt and will be continued to be felt around the region. In terms of U.S. policy, there's books and articles and much history that has documented how U.S. intervention, particularly, in the last decade, but since the 60s, 70s, 80s, the way in which we've really destabilized governments, supported coups across the region, and again, through counterinsurgency measures and other foreign policies that have really wreaked havoc. Again, we're not saying that climate change is the only factor driving migration, but it aggravates many of those that are already there, from economic insecurity to political instability.
And finally, your own country, Camila, Colombia. The indigenous governor, Sandra Liliana Peña, was just gunned down in the Cauca region. But she is among many hundreds of rights activists, the 52nd social leader killed just this year, and that over 1,100 activists and land defenders have been killed since the 2016 peace deal was signed. Let's end with Colombia.
It's a sad story because it could have been prevented. We knew this was going to happen. We knew that after the 2016 peace agreement was signed, there would be a spike in violence, especially from right-wing, criminal bands, and that precisely those people who've been defending their water and their land and peace, really, for decades would be targeted. So the government knew exactly what was going to happen and has not done enough. It was already bad under the prior administration, but it's only, as you mentioned, gotten much worse. So it's also a crisis that we're facing and that we must take seriously.
Camila Bustos, we want to thank you for being with us. Human Rights Associate at the University Network for Human Rights, one of the co-authors of the new report, which we will link to at democracynow.org, Shelter from the Storm, Policy Options to Address Climate-Induced Displacement from the Northern Triangle. When we come back, we go to the continent. We go to Africa. We'll be joined by two leading African climate activists. Stay with us.
Ohio, but my city was gone. There was no train station, there was no downtown. South Tower had disappeared. All my favorite places, my city had been pulled down, reduced to parking spaces. Hey, oh, where to go, Ohio?
My city was gone by the Pretenders. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. By the way, you can watch, listen, and read transcripts using our iOS and Android apps. Download them for free from the Apple App Store or Google Play Store today. As we continue to look at President Biden's climate summit and the state of the climate emergency, we end today's show with two leading activists from Africa. Joining us from Mozambique, Dipti Bhatnagar. She's International Program Coordinator for Climate Justice and Energy at Friends of the Earth International. She also works on climate justice with Friends of the Earth Mozambique. And Kumi Naidoo is with us, joining us from Johannesburg, South Africa, Special Advisor for the Green Economy Coalition's Social Contract Initiative, also Global Ambassador for Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity, and the former Secretary General of Amnesty International, also former head of Greenpeace International. So, Kumi, here in Washington, D.C., President Biden just is holding this two-day global climate summit. What do you think has to happen now? Your assessment of what's happening there, and what do you see happening on the continent?
Well, firstly, I think we have to recognize that we are playing catch-up. That, in fact, because of foot dragging, particularly on the part of the United States, not only with Trump, but even with previous administrations, we have ended up with the situation that we are basically sort of 1 minute to midnight in terms of the climate crisis. So we have to be very clear that when we judge the summit, this summit must meet this criteria. Does what comes out of the summit reflect this reality that the decade that we are in is the most urgent and most consequential decade in humanity's history, and the changes that we make in this decade will determine what future we have or whether we have a future at all. So what we need to be looking at from the summit to judge whether it has understood the urgency sufficiently is whether, in fact, we get baby steps in the right direction or rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, or whether we get a real commitment of understanding that we need structural and systemic change with regard to our economic system, our energy system, our food system, our transport system, and so on. Bottom line is, given the scale of the crisis right now, the only thing that is going to get us out of it is not baby steps in the right direction. It's going to be big, bold, courageous, structural and systemic change to every aspect of society. And right now, while the summit is moving in the right direction from where Trump was, I think it still needs to go a long way before, for example, it links the question of climate change and the question of inequality, which more and more people are recognizing is fundamentally linked.
During President Biden's climate summit, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa called on wealthy nations to provide more aid to developing nations to address climate change. This is what he said.
It is important that aid on climate change should be provided separately and should not be part of conventional development assistance. When it is given in the form of loan financing, the debt burden of developing countries is worsened. We call on developed economies, which historically bear the greatest responsibility for emissions, to meet their responsibilities to developing economies.
Can you comment on your president's proposal, Kumi?
Well, just to be very clear, when developing countries or countries in the global south, as we prefer to say, when we are asking for support, whether it's Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, Caribbean, we're not asking for charity. We're simply saying, let's recognize the history of this problem, that Europe, North America, and other developed countries built the economy on dirty energy. Now we are saying to poor countries, no, you can't do the same, right? We're saying to them, you cannot make the same mistake that the rich countries have made. And therefore, we're not asking for charity here. What we're asking is for redress, we're asking for recompense, and we're asking basically for rich countries to pay their climate debt, right? It's clear, the statistics are clear in terms of the volume of the historical emissions and so on. But the bottom line is, this is not an act of charity in two ways. One, it's doing the right thing, but also it's in the self-interest of rich countries. Unless rich countries and poor countries get it in their heads now that we get it right as rich and poor countries acting together and we might secure, and I say might, let's be very clear, we have left things so late that it is a question about whether in fact we can avert the worst of catastrophic climate change. So that's the spirit in which I think we need to be having the conversations right now.
I wanted to bring Dipti Bhatnagar into the conversation. Kumi Naidoo is in Johannesburg. Dipti is in Maputo, Mozambique. As you watch the global summit in Washington, your thoughts on what's being proposed? A lot is being made of President Biden saying he'd cut carbon emissions of the United States, one of the biggest and historically biggest polluter in the world, by 52% by 2030. What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Amy. Thanks for having me. Hi, Kumi. As Kumi said, it's really interesting that this summit is definitely going in the right direction and sending a signal that the U.S. is willing to work on the catastrophe of climate change. But the pledges that have come out of the U.S. until now are just woefully insufficient, Amy. So the number you quoted just now, what the U.S. pledged on the table on Earth Day is about 50 to 52% reductions based on 2005 levels by 2030. Friends of the Earth US, ActionAid US, and many other groups put together what should be the US's actual fair share. So when we talk about fair share, we're talking about the historical responsibility. And the US is the biggest historical emitter, Amy, of greenhouse gases. So we're calling on the US to do its fair share of emissions reductions. And what that means is 4 times of what the US has put on the table on Earth Day. So the US actually needs to be committing to about 195% reduction in emissions based on 2005 levels. Now, obviously, that is not really physically possible within a single country. So what that translates to is about 70% emissions reductions in the US itself, the domestic effort. And at the same time, this has to come with a sense of solidarity, Amy. The only way that the US can actually meet its fair share is to support our countries in the global south, as Kumi was saying, to undertake this very, very essential energy transformation that we need, this system change that we're going to need. So we're calling on the US, along with the US organizations, for the US to meet its fair share of emissions reductions. That's just one part of what the US has put on the table yesterday. There's also an element of climate finance that they've put forward, which is woefully low. And at the same time, Amy, there's another element to this, which is fossil fuel financing, ending fossil fuel financing. So what the US has said is that the Development Finance Corporation is going to go net zero by 2040. And if you don't mind, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about this concept of net zero and just how dangerous and damaging it is. So net zero basically is a corporate strategy. It's a smoke screen, Amy. It is put forward by the most polluting corporations in the world. And all these corporations suddenly have stepped up with these net zero targets. We'll do net zero by so-and-so year. And you wonder, why are they suddenly so eager to come with a target where they've actually squashed climate science for decades? And it's because net zero actually allows them to get away with continuing to pollute, continuing business as usual, because what net zero says is that we can suck the carbon back out of the atmosphere. So this is about offsets, and this is about so-called sequestering carbon. And whose land, whose forests are they going to so-called use for the offsets? Whose rivers and lakes are they actually going to use to sequester this carbon? It's coming to our countries in the global south, Amy. It's coming to communities who are using their lands, their forests, their rivers to stay alive. And what net zero is going to do is trigger a huge land grab. More than that is happening already in our countries of the global south. So when the Development Finance Corporation of the US says, we'll go net zero by 2040, that means that the signal that they're sending is that they want to continue polluting and that they're going to go after other people's lands and forests to be able to offset their emissions. So this is just extremely damaging. And that is something that we need to see really change coming out of the US and our own countries. I mean, I will stand up to our governments in the global south to say, don't accept this, because your people's lands, your people's forests are going to be really grabbed for, capitalist expansion. They just want to continue expanding markets. So commodifying nature is the next market. And that's something we are really, really fighting against.
I wanted to get both of your comments on China's role. The Chinese President Xi Jinping addressed the climate summit Thursday, repeating his pledge for China to cap emissions by 2030 and be carbon neutral by 2060. He also vowed to reduce China's dependence on coal.
We need to give full recognition to developing countries' contribution to climate action and accommodate their particular difficulties and concerns. Developed countries need to increase climate ambition and action and make concrete efforts to help developing countries accelerate the transition to green and low-carbon development.
So, Dipti and then Kumi, talk about China's role, both in Africa and its effect on the planet. The U.S. and China, of course, the largest carbon emitters.
I thought that the Chinese sort of signal on coal was very, very interesting because because this opens up space for Chinese campaigners and for all of us to really push back against the coal that China is pushing, also in terms of financing in Africa. Now, I want to be really, really clear that China is not a historical emitter. They do not bear historical responsibility for the climate crisis. And that is something we really do need to remember, that the countries that bear historical responsibility and have been the largest emitters need to do more and need to do it first. But at the same time, China is being a sub-imperial force in many parts of Africa, including Mozambique, where I am right now. The type of dirty energy projects that they're pushing, the type of land grabbing and monoculture plantations projects that they're pushing is extremely damaging and is also grabbing community lands and destroying forests. So we really need to be able to hold China accountable for its actions while at the same time understanding that it's not a historical polluter. So it's really about that system change that we need to bring about, Amy, which is to hold everybody responsible that's contributing to these oppressions that are deepening. And that also means challenging China as a new sort of colonizer in the continent, and also continuing to challenge, and India as well, and also continuing to challenge the northern countries, the global north, who have, of course, historical colonial extractive relationships with Africa. So we really need to be challenging all of that and calling for system change in order to be able to stop the climate crisis.
And Kumi Naidu, the difference between the approaches of China and the United States, why it matters for Africa, and describe the effects of climate change in your country in South Africa.
Let me first endorse fully what Dipti said. And I think that the differences that we see right now between US and China, in the end result, I wonder whether it's going to be substantially different for us. Both actually are driven by a language of aid and generosity and so on. But as Dipti says, we're going to have to be extremely vigilant to ensure that whatever investments are coming, we can manage it the best we can and limit the damage. Because let's be clear, things that are coming in right now, as Dipti said, some of the examples she gave from China are actually causing a negative effect, as historically we've been having from the Western world. But I think for China, beyond what Dipti had said, which I fully endorse, I think, let's be very clear, a 2060 target, the 2030 target is good. The 2061 needs to be brought back in terms of going completely carbon neutral. The reality is, whether we like it or not, when China decides to do something at the top, they can deliver and make it happen because of a different political reality. I think that it's time that China does recognize, as the United States needs to, that it is in their self-interest to make these changes as fast as possible. And let me just say, in fairness to China, that historically,
we have 15 seconds to end.
Oh, okay. So I think now is the time for action. We must evaluate the summit not in terms of vague promises. We need to see what the implementation plan, and they need to be checked in Glasgow to make sure that this was just not another talk shop. Thank you.
Kumi Naidu, I want to thank you for being with us, Special Advisor for the Green Economy Coalition's Social Contract Initiative, former head of Amnesty International and Greenpeace, and Dipti Bhatnagar of Friends of the Earth International. That does it for our show. I'm Amy Goodman. Stay safe. Wear a mask.